Well, due to popular demand, people seemed very interested in this breakdown of a shot that I needed to complete for work to integrate this shot of some coal handling terminal at sunset. The original footage didn't look like this. The original footage looked like this. It was just the wrong time of day for the other shots in the sequence. So this was shot close to the port and there was no sunset. The sunset was quite extreme with a lot of golden God rays poking through the clouds. So I thought it'd be nice to integrate this close up with those shots as well. Now in this shot, the coal handling graders are pushing the coal backwards and forwards. You can see them here moving. But when I pulled a key from this sky, when I pulled a key off the sky, unfortunately this grader's blade is also peak white, and so it was poking through my key. In order to fix that in the 3D composite, over here, I had to occlude that hole by putting another object in there. So if we have a look at this in this mode, if we go behind the scene, there's a little cube over here that's just occluding the light from behind. You can't quite see it in this view. So that cube is actually on a empty, or attached to an empty, and that empty was tracked into place with motion tracking. So we go to motion tracking, I just track that blade as it moved across and applied through the solve, I applied geometry there, so 3D markers or link empty to track. So I link the empty to that track in that view, which you can see up here. Moving, oh, there it is, it's that one. Moving around, that orange one. So back in the layout, it is effectively attached to that grader as it moves backwards and forwards. So it's blocking out that little hole. So it's a mask shape that I applied in the 3D view rather than in 2D view. Oh, you can see it better in wireframe. Here we go. Whoa, there we are. So that's just blocking out the light. Interestingly, I also applied a camera wobble, a little bit of handling with Mr. Dodo birds, or let me see, camera wobble, here we go, camera wobble add-on, which is very good. Thank you very much, Ian. And it doesn't play back in real time at the moment because of all the volumetrics, but it is very effective when it's wound down to a tasteful amount. The other thing that I learned was that I had to deal with these volumetrics. I put multiple lights in the background to produce these God rays, and the volumetric that I'm using is a cube rather than world volumetric. I found that the world volumetric was troublesome because it was too coarse. So when I used a world or a world sort of fog, the density or the slices that it uses to sample the volume away from the camera ended up being too far apart. But when you constrain it to a volume like this or a box, you can get much better handling of where the samples occur. You could also trim the samples by going to your world attributes, volumetric attributes for the scene, I mean. Let me see. Here they are, down here. So you can trim where the fog starts and ends, so you can have those God rays sort of further back away from the camera like that, and you can see that I'm compressing. Oh, I don't have as much density now because the fog is literally thinner. If I turn this on to this view, you can see how I'm constraining the fog like this. I probably won't show in this because it's camera view dependent where I start the volumetric. You can see in the camera view how it's winding back and out again. So more or less volumetric away from us. And in this view, it's going away from the view window, so it doesn't really help. But anyway, in the camera view, you can use that to great effect. Just put it back to where it was. You'll notice in the 3D view window over here that the lights that I have simulating the sun are nowhere near as far away as typical sun would be. And that's because it didn't need to be. I'm in a fixed viewpoint and it becomes effectively single point perspective. So my single point is this sun lamp over here, and I can move that around and get different positions for my God rays, or crepuscular rays if you like. I could pop it up there behind that cloud as well. And the clouds in this view are really just, I'm going to put it back where it was, the clouds in this view are really just distorted geometry. So nothing terribly serious going on with these clouds, just a lot of distortion and displacement. And they're really there just to block the light and give interesting highlights along the edges to simulate the clouds that I had in the actual sunset shots that surround this shot. And they were really there to provide additional light control. So in the volumetric, if I turn on these light occluding clouds, you can see that the whole scene brightens up quite a bit. Don't want that, so turn them back on and you really cover up those lights and change the density and therefore the contrast ratio in the foreground. Another problem with the contrast ratio was that I had to illuminate the actual surface of this image plane. If I turn, let me see, go to this view and we turn off the volumetric, look out, it's very bright, looks terrible. The sun is, the scene is way over illuminated now, but anyway, if we go down here, I'm not using an emissive plane, I'm using a diffuse plane, and that was so that the volumetric effect would take effect, and you wouldn't get so much of the original lighting, because this does not look like sunset much. Fortunately, it is backlit or top lit, much like as I need it, but a lot of it is front lit and looks a bit odd, so I couldn't use an emissive plane in this case. But that also meant that I was not able to see what was happening in the foreground, because all my lights were behind the scene, so they were behind this plane, which is keyed, which causes the occlusion to give me the God rays. But because all the lights were behind, you couldn't see anything on the foreground. So I've had to supplement the foreground with some lighting as well. And in the foreground, if we pop back to wireframe, you can see down the bottom, I have some, I have some other lamps down here. Can't turn them. Here we go, fill lights. So these lights down the bottom are producing some controlled lighting in the foreground. If I turn back on the volumetric and I turn off those lights, you can see that they're not contributing anything anymore. So this plane is very empty, and these are very dark, and the volumetric lighting is too strong, so I needed to bring up those levels, but I didn't want to do it based on the material with emission, because that's difficult to control interactively. You'd have to build masks, which I did do for something else, but in this case I used local lighting. The great thing about lighting in Eevee, much as I guess you can do in cycles, is that you can control the way that the light falls in your volume. And what I mean by that is, if we go over here to the light properties, you can actually change the contributions based on the type of lighting. So if I turn off the light there in the middle, you can see it dims. This is just the diffuse lighting. I didn't use specular because reflections suck. But if I used volumetric, then I'm going to overwhelm my volume. That was no good. But because I could turn that off, that means that I was choosing to only light the surface of this plane. Now, light groups would be great, because light groups mean that you could, say, associate a light with a particular object. If I had another foreground plane with an alpha channel, I could light that independently. If I had a light group, that I could put that light and that object in together in the scene, that'd be great. But in this case, all I can do is separate out volumetric from diffuse or specularity. But it's quite useful. And I also found that I could put a light up near this cabin or large shed on top of the infrastructure, so that I could see a bit more of this detail. And I think, which light is that? It's not the sun. Nope. Let me see. It's one of these lights. I'm sure it's that one. Not that one. Not that one. Fill light. Not that one. Anyway, I had to light this shed up as well, so I'm not sure which one that is. Should be one of these. This is riveting viewing, I'm sure. Oh, the other thing about lighting, of course, is that, maybe it's this one. The other thing about the lighting is that in Eevee you can easily change the distance of the light effect by changing the, oh there we go, there's the fall off for that light. So you can see my key isn't actually all that great. It's fine when it's in shade, but when I expand it you can see all these white bits here. That's not so great. So I don't want to illuminate my bad key, so I just want to illuminate this shed. So based on the size of the light, I can just wind back its fall off so that it's no longer affecting that shed. If I zoom in, you can see that taking effect. See how it falls away? So we're only on the shed, and then I can get rid of it till we get to the shed. So I just need to bring forward the shed, but not everything else. Now, also about the bad key, if I go back here, you can see that I built the key elsewhere. Whoops, wrong one. Here's my mat. It was a bit awkward to pull this key. It's not a great key. I've masked down the bottom here in the material view. But all of this fine detail it had a lot of fine edges, so it was difficult to pull a decent Luma key or anything off of. And the video, to be honest, was only 8-bit video anyway, so it's not a terrific key. But I thought it would be fine. Unfortunately in Eevee you can't do erode or anything like that. But what I was able to do over here, where it looked quite bad, was apply a bit of blur, and you can see some of the bad key coming over this hill. So what do I mean by that? If I click back on our object and have a look over here, if you have an image like this, our coal handling facility, we can distort the vector of the image by applying noise to the vector. So if we apply noise, we distort the actual image underneath. And we do that through a linear light mix with the original UV coordinates. So here's the UV coordinate that I originally was using to drive the layout of the plane. I mix that with a little bit of linear light, but the mix factor is driven by a mask shape. So the mask shape is back over here in this node group, and I got this online from a user on Twitter who was able to, whoops, there's the group, and it's really just taking some texture coordinates. I've remapped the location of this object coordinate using some vector math to produce a nice shape. I don't think there's an easy way of demonstrating this, because I don't really want to ruin my mat. Let's see if it will show us. If I go to turn off volume, here we go. Oh, there it is. So yes, here's the mask shape if I was using it the way that it appears here. So I can change the shape and layout of the mask like this. Move it across. It's a really handy little note group, to be honest. It just means that I can apply a mask wherever I want it, and this fall off will drive the mix value of the linear light and how much noise from the noise texture with ridiculously large numbers gets contributed to the vector of the image. and then how much of that gets mixed into the image. So let me turn back on this and our volume. And see how much of it is blurred. It's a noisy blur, but nobody really notices because of the fog, because of all the dust in the sky. But you can see if I change the way that the alpha is handled, you can see more or less of that blur. You see the blur coming and going up here. More blur, less blur, more blur, less blur. And that's controlled by the mask location. So I can have less of this bad key by having more blur. So that was some of the pitfalls. Oh, the other thing that I did was, this plane looks unusual. It has a little bit of extrusion or bend at the front here. So I brought this bottom section, foreground layer, out somewhat, away from the background or the top half of the image, just so that I could, you can see this crosshair, whoops, there's a crosshair there anyway from the camera. So where's that camera? Here it is. I'll scale, whoops, scale up the camera. You can see that its target is the depth of field or focal plane. The focal plane is on this foreground element where the fence is, right there. And it has a super shallow depth of field, in this case 0.035, and that's all fine. It doesn't have to be like a real camera, but that was to give my key a bit of help. I was able to drop off the focus on these background elements, just so that the depth of field would make it less obvious that it's a pretty nasty key. So just a little hint of depth of field for blur. And the other thing I did was do a bit of light wrap with bloom. So turn the bloom off, you can see less wrap. Turn the bloom back on, just a little bit more wrap, and really it was around that main sunlight, the way that it's been trimmed. So there you go, that's effectively how that shot is built to use in 3D. So this is a 2D composite in 3D view. There's not much keying going on. The keying was done elsewhere. I tried to do the key in the material view, but because we don't have a proper blur function, you can't do choking and things like that. And it's very difficult to control the locations of your choke with fall off and what have you, because the mask tool is very good in the tracker, but it doesn't really apply very well in the material nodes. Because we don't have integrated texture nodes, I think is probably the main reason for that. But there you go. Hopefully that's been of some help. Oh, there was some negative light in here. I don't know if that's interesting, but the negative light is producing this little bit of red that you can see, which I noticed in the original source footage. A little bit of red light, and that's a light with negative values. I don't think I'll be able to find that easily, that light. There's so many lights in this scene. Let me see. Where is the negative light? Is it up here? Oh, I can't access the lights. Let me see. Light. I'm not sure which light it is, but it's just a light with a negative value, which makes a subtractive colour as well. So there you go. That is my little 3D composite breakdown. I hope that's of help to somebody. I'm not sure that I would need to do this very often, but it just seemed to suit the nature of the shot that I had going at the time. A lot of these density effects for the volumetric itself. If I click on the volume and we go back to object, it's a mix of, I don't know why it's on transparent, but the volume scatter, I didn't use a volume BSDF or principled volume, I used the volume scatter instead. These values worked quite well. Anisotropy dialed back this far instead of going the other way because I would get too much front scatter off of that. It looks really cool if there's very bright alien lights pointed at your face at night maybe, but in the daytime I really just needed the effect of the rays, not so much from the light itself, so I didn't need any bounce back or reflection from the volume. If I turned up the density you couldn't see any of the rays anymore. So it's a fine line between getting the right amount of contrast from the volume and its anisotropy. Go back too far and you can see the very, very bad key. So it's hiding a lot of ills. It'd be great if we could have decent keys, to be honest, in materials. That would be super awesome. But as I say, it's the main problem is the lack of blur function. It would be nice if you could do a per material blur and set it based on the scale of the object or the scale of the image. I gather, though, that devs aren't very happy about that sort of thing because they do deal in screen space for resolution, and when you're calculating a blur, when the blur's back here and it's only taking up 10 pixels, that's fine, but what if you're really close and now that 10 pixels is like 1,000 pixels? How does the blur work? It would just look like this, I guess, or blocky. So yeah, they're not that keen, but I think it'd be awesome. Anyway, there's a breakdown for that scene. I hope that was helpful. Thanks for listening. Bye.